Hello, I'm Tom Oliver. I'm here in Geneva at a meeting called Nature as Diplomat, and it's about better representing nature on the international stage. So I've been asked to give a presentation on different types of nature-centric approach. So I thought I'd share that with you now. Now, there's growing consensus amongst science policy organisations. So these are organisations like the UN Environment Programme, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the European Environment Agency. And these organisations agree now that we need to work at the deeper level of cultural change if we want to successfully protect and restore the environment. And that goes right down to our mindsets and worldviews and our relationship with each other and the natural world. So on the top right here, this systems thinking iceberg model demonstrates this principle well. So on the surface of the iceberg, this is the things you can see. So we might see food prices, rising rapidly on the world markets. And we could think about initiating technological, solutions, fixes. We might think about robotic pollinators to address the loss of hoverflies and bees. We might think about genetic modification to enhance productivity. But none of these really address the root causes of our crop failures and food shortages. If we go below that level on the iceberg, we can look at the more proximate causes, and maybe it's extreme weather events caused by climate change. And we could think about, trying to address that. We could think about reducing the impacts of climate change by geoengineering. So this is, the idea of technologies to put mirrors in space to reflect sunlight back into space, or to whiten the clouds so we reduce the warming of the Earth and reflect the sun's light back out into space. But these are obviously just kind of superficial fixes that only address the symptoms. And below that in the iceberg is the root causes. And namely, that's our culture, essentially our mindsets and worldviews collectively scaled up. And, so if we want to change the way our institutions work, if we want to change our economy, change the legal systems and education systems, which are, not doing many favors for nature on the planet, then we need to change our culture. And that's recognized by these different science policy agencies. You can see here the quotes by the UN General Assembly talking about moving away from a human-centered approach. And an organization called IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, talks about the root cause of our problems being a sense of disconnection from each other and nature. So we're talking about shifting from a human-centered approach to what you might call a nature-centric perspective. And that's where we see humans not as exceptional and distinct and superior, but enmeshed in the web of life where all species have intrinsic value. And it's a worldview which occurs in many indigenous cultures around the world. These cultures are diverse, but there's a common thread that they see nature as an ancestor or as a type of kin. Incidentally, it's also common in our Western culture. So this is a result actually just from last week, as I speak about about 500 English farmers were interviewed, and these are the types of conceptual framing here. You can see whether you see yourself as separate from nature or part of nature. And 89% of English farmers agreed with the statement, nature is an important part of who I am. So it's also a prevalent worldview in our Western cultures as well, even if it's not represented in our institutions. In countries like the UK, we treat nature as an asset or as a form of capital and distance ourselves from it. But that's not the way most people see their relationship with nature. And incidentally, the science of our connection to nature, science from cell biology to evolutionary biology to cognitive neuroscience, completely supports the view that we are part of nature. It's fully commensurate with these worldview that nature is an intrinsic part of us. And so whether that's the 37 trillion cells in our body that are bacterial cells and are so essential for our function, to our DNA, which is obviously borrowed from our ancestors and will pass it on to ancestors to come, and the way that DNA travels horizontally, but also vertically, but also horizontally across the tree of life. And we borrow genes across species vectored by viruses. And actually, our DNA is essentially just cut and paste from that whole web of life, so that we're 99% similar to each other, but equally 30% similar to a simple bacteria. So that DNA is just a cut and paste from the web of life. And biologists like Lynn Margulis talk about there being just one web of life, one life form which spreads across the entire planet. And neuroscience talks about the 170 billion neurons in our brain that are constantly rewiring all the time, determining our personality. And they're affected by our environment, and that's the sounds, the touch, the smell, the chemicals of nature all around us, structuring our waking consciousness. So science fully supports this view. And if we do have this philosophical pivot where we see nature as part of ourselves, then what could that mean then if we scaled that up and changed our culture and cascade up to change the way our institutions work? So in our Western context, we might have very different ways of governing the environment, and they might seem more radical. But the word radical actually comes from the Latin root, meaning root cause. And so we're getting really at the root cause of these problems, which is our relationship to nature. So I'll just quickly go around this diagram. We've got on the top left, we've got these approaches called rights of nature. And this is the idea that we legally enshrine the rights of nature in our legal systems, maybe even given personhood rights to natural entities. So Ecuador is a country that's led the way on this. In 2008, put nature in the constitution with a call to enforce the rights of nature by all persons, communities, peoples, or nationalities. They can call upon the public authorities to enforce the rights of nature. Another example, go across the world to New Zealand. In 2017, they granted the Wanganui River legal status, so it has personhood rights. Let's zip across to Europe, and in Spain, the municipality of Los Alcazares approved rights of nature for a lake called a lagoon called Mar Menor in 2020. In the UK government pushes back against rights of nature approaches, but actually many local councils, I think counting more than 17 different rivers now, have local charters or declarations of river rights. So that's rights of nature. If we move across to the top right now, we have the idea of representing nature and organizations. So this, for example, could be putting nature on the board. So we have, examples like the cosmetics company Faith in Nature that have a representative speaking for nature in the boardroom and helping to inform different decision making. But it doesn't just have to be restricted to putting nature on the board. If you're thinking about putting nature at the heart of your organization, you might think about training schemes to help think about individual development. What are the schemes you might take your workforce, offer your workforce for shifting that culture and pushing back against that anthropocentric bias where we see ourselves as separate from nature? We might think about organizational comms and our organizational culture. We might think about the aims and protocols that structure our organization. So can we change the articles of association or the incentive structures for promotion? And then we might think about decision architectures. So, for example, that is the example of having nature on the board, but equally it could be taking your boardroom outside and making more decisions out in natural places, which research shows makes nature more salient, and we make decisions which are more favorable to nature. Or we can bring nature into the workplace. Finally, we can think about leadership. So leadership by example. So modeling the mindsets and behavior change that we want to transform in the company. So if we move round to the bottom right here, we have financial mechanisms. Now, there's a range of different kind of innovative financial mechanisms that are starting to appear. Common to all of these is the idea that nature should benefit from or even own organizational processes. So these primarily involve financial instruments, but they can have parallel legal innovations, such as a framework where land can own itself, as an example. Another example is of a financial mechanism are purpose trusts. So these are a legal mechanism by which profits of a company are mandated to serve nature rather than any other shareholders. So, for example, the clothing company Patagonia has the earth as the only shareholder. And finally, now on the bottom left, we have what we call multi-species assemblies. This is where, in a decision-making context, individuals represent different species. So they try to take the perspective of what a species would feel like or be impacted by a certain decision, and then they represent that view in a meeting. So one form of this is called interspecies councils. These have been done from in the UK. Our Department for Environment was engaged in one in the River Roding. This image here is from a mountain community of Oppdal in Norway. I think one thing to say about these approaches actually is one challenge with all of nature representation is how to represent the views of nature, in this case individual species, without kind of a bias of our own thoughts or preferences. So you can see here the quote that I'm worried there's too much of me, says a birch. Now, understanding the ecology and evolution of birch trees, I don't know if it's true that a birch tree would be concerned about the number of birch trees that there are and there being too many. So, is this the voice of the birch tree, or is this the voice of the person concerned about the balance of nature here? So, challenging approach, but many of these multi-species assemblies can also have value not outside of decision-making context, also in artistic approaches or educational settings, and just helping us to better empathize with nature. So those are the four approaches, and one challenge is how to expand these approaches if we think they're worthwhile and worth experimenting, and to maintain their integrity. So this is a framework here on this last slide about how to maintain the robustness of these approaches. So the integrity is the extent to which these approaches really do represent nature in its entirety, which is obviously challenging. The inviolability is the degree to which the approach can be maintained without becoming diluted. So for example, through greenwash, lots of companies might start adopting nature on their board, but actually in many cases it might just be, not effective, and it's a kind of a greenwashing technique. Actionability is the potential of the approach to actually inform real-world decisions that have impact. And the last two, flexibility and scalability, really relate to the ability of the approach to be tried in different geographies where there might be very different contexts, different types of culture, different types of challenge, and the extent in which they can be scaled up rapidly to lots of different organizations. So this is a framework by which we're suggesting we can start to evaluating and guide and work together collaboratively to develop these nature-centric governance approaches. So in a nutshell, it's about governing the environment in a way which is not seeing ourselves as separate and isolated from nature, but as seeing ourselves part of that web of life. And what does it mean if we then change the way we run our institutions, essentially, and protect nature and the biosphere in a much more effective way? Okay. Thank you very much.